All right. Thank you, everybody. Welcome. It is 7:34 Eastern, 4:34 Pacific. This event lasts another 56 minutes. We are not going to go long. We respect your time, and we're enormously grateful that you are here to listen to some of this great data that we've got and have a wonderful, I hope, Q&A session. So before we get started, I just wanted to tell you a little bit about how this evening is going to go. First, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Nathaniel Stinnett. I'm the founder and executive director of the Environmental Voter Project. And I'm going to very, very briefly, really briefly, just give a quick overview of the Environmental Voter Project. But I hope you'll forgive me that I'm going to assume that most, if not all of you, are already familiar with our work. This is not meant to be an introduction to us, so I'm going to breeze through who we are. Then I'm going to get into some of this new data that we've got in our Green Voters, or the hidden potential of green voters in red states report. Then we will have a Q&A session. Certainly feel free to ask questions in the chat throughout the presentation, but please just know we aren't going to get to those questions until the Q&A session. Once the Q&A session happens, maybe your question will be answered by an EVP staff member over chat. Maybe I will answer it. Hopefully between those two groups, we'll get to everybody. If we don't, please forgive us, but we will try to answer every question that we've got. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen here. All right. Ren or someone else on EVP staff, is screen share working and the slides going back and forth?
Yes, it looks good.
Great, thank you. All right, welcome everybody. As I said, I'll start by giving a very quick overview of the Environmental Voter Project. EVP is a nonpartisan nonprofit that is laser focused on just two things. One, finding environmentalists who don't vote, and then two, turning them into better voters. I'll say that again. We find environmentalists who don't vote, and then we turn them into better voters. That's it. So what that also means is that we don't do a lot of the things that your typical environmental nonprofits do focus on. For instance, we don't endorse candidates. We don't lobby for particular policies. We don't even try to convince people to care more about climate or the environment, as odd as that might sound. A good way to think of us is we're laser focused not on changing people's opinions or changing their minds, but rather on just changing their behavior. We find people who list climate or the environment as their #1 priority, but aren't voting, and then we turn them into better voters. So we're really just in the behavior change game. Very quickly, how do we do it? These 3 steps that you see right here. First, identification. We use data analytics to build predictive models that allow us to individually identify registered voters who list climate or the environment as their #1 priority, yet aren't voting. We'll get into a little bit of how we do that over the next few slides, but only a little bit. The second step is, once we find those people who list climate or the environment as their top priority but aren't voting, well, they don't need any issue education. They don't need their minds changed. They need a behavioral intervention. And so you'll see the second step, mobilization, we're able to bypass the hardest, most expensive part of politics at this point, which is changing people's minds, and cut right to the easy stuff, or the easier stuff, which is changing their voting behavior. And so we run dozens of randomized control trials each year, just trying to isolate which messages work best with which subgroups of these non-voting environmentalists, just to do one thing, and that's turn them into better voters. That's all we're focused on. We're pretty much like data scientists and behavioral scientists trying to figure out how do we get more of these already persuaded environmentalists to vote. And then third, habit reinforcement. We work year-round, using every election as a behavioral intervention opportunity. Because you don't need to be a behavioral scientist to understand that if you're trying to change someone's habits, if you're trying to get someone to vote more often, boy, is it hard if you only talk to them once every 2 years when there's a big, sexy federal election going on. It just doesn't work. And so we work year-round, using local, state, federal, primary, general, special, every election as an opportunity to change their voting habits. Very quickly, we've been getting great results. Just in 2020, randomized control trials showed that we were solely responsible, while controlling for all outside variables, for increasing turnout 1.8 percentage points among our targets in Pennsylvania for the presidential general. Now, to be clear, we weren't targeting every single voter in Pennsylvania. We were only targeting the environmentalists who were unlikely to vote. But that's a big, big bump in turnout, especially in an election where $14 billion were spent. We boosted turnout 0.6 percentage points among our targets in Florida. 2 months later, in the Georgia US Senate runoffs, we boosted turnout 0.9 percentage points while controlling for all outside variables. And most importantly, over the long term, we have been able to have an extraordinary cumulative impact on how many environmentalists are voting in our states. We're currently in 17 states, and I'll get into what those states are in a second. But up until the end of 2020, we were in these 12 states. And you'll see, after 2 years in a state, we start tracking how many of these non-voters have now become consistent super voters, such that they're voting in every election, federal, state, and local. And you'll see, after just 5 years, we have targeted 6.3 million non-voting environmentalists, and 730,000 of them are now super voters who never miss an election. Now, this metric is different from randomized control trials. I can't claim that we are solely responsible for making these 730,000 super voters, but we're pretty darn responsible, because there aren't many other organizations who are working in local elections and state elections year-round. We've already been active in over 370 elections just this year. So that's what the Environmental Voter Project does. This is some of our impact. I encourage you to go to our website, to our 2019-2020 impact report. And there should be a link in the chat sometime soon if you're interested in reading more about our voter mobilization work. But the real reason we're here tonight is, as we do this identification and mobilization and habit reinforcement work, that first step, the identification part, also tells us a lot about who these environmentalists are. When we build these predictive models and identify all these non-voting environmentalists, we get a lot of really rich data sets out of it. And we don't just want to use it for our mobilization work. We also want to share it with the broader public, because sometimes it yields some pretty extraordinary findings and opportunities for the climate movement. So what we are going to be discussing tonight is a report, and hopefully there will be a link in the chat, a report called The Hidden Potential of Green Voters in Red States. There was also an article, a few articles, but one article in particular by Inside Climate News, and you can see the cover of it there, that was written about the piece. I'm going to jump into the data, but before I do that, I want to talk about everybody's favorite topic, and that is methodology. If you don't already know that the Environmental Voter Project are the nerds of the environmental movement, but boy, are you going to figure it out now. Before we jump into any data, it's always important to figure out and to understand, how did we measure this data? What does it mean and what does it not mean? So very, very quickly, as I said, I'm going to jump into methodology. And first, I'm going to talk about this. There's a difference between polling and predictive models, and it's important to understand that. I'm not going to read every part of this slide. I know that you can all read it yourself, but at a very sort of high level, I just want to say polls are very, very good at telling you the characteristics of a population. So which of a few small subgroups in a population of voters feel this way or that way, or prioritize this issue or that issue. Predictive models are different. And it's not that one is better than the other, it's that they have different purposes. Whereas polls are trying to provide a sort of an accurate snapshot of a population, predictive models are trying to identify individuals. Predictive models are essentially targeting tools, not public opinion tools. And what predictive models do is they don't say, oh, 20% of this state cares about the environment. What they try to do is they try to say, here are the individuals who care about the environment. Mary Smith on 123 Main Street has a really high likelihood of caring about the environment. So predictive models are individual targeting tools. And at the end of the day, what a good predictive model does is it provides you scores. It provides a score to every single person in the voter file telling you who are the people with the very, very highest likelihood of having the attributes that you care about. Again, if you're really curious about this, I'm happy to go into more detail in the Q&A, but I don't want to presume to know what you are most curious about. Instead, I just want to give you the background that we need to dive into the data. One more thing about methodology. For this particular data set, we surveyed almost 9,000 people, and we tried to isolate people who didn't just say that they cared about climate change or the environment, but listed it as their #1 issue priority over all other issues. Now, throughout this presentation and throughout our report, you will see a very important definition, and that is low propensity environmental voters. The last thing I'm going to do when I'm done boring you with this methodology thing is just describe what that definition is. Environmental voter, what do we mean by that? We mean these were people who, after building this predictive model and identifying all these people who said climate change or the environment was their #1 priority, we have identified environmental voters as people who have at least a 75% likelihood of meeting that criteria. These are people who are at least 75% likely to not just care about climate or the environment, but listed as their #1 priority. All right, what does the second half of that definition mean? Low propensity. Well, obviously, whether you are a low propensity voter depends on what election you're talking about. There are a lot of people on this call who are probably low propensity voters for a library trustee election, but you're not a low propensity voter for a presidential general. So what we had to do is we chose an election. And what we chose was the upcoming 2022 midterm elections. And we looked at previous voter histories and worked with other predictive models. And what we decided was people who had a less than 50% likelihood of voting in next year's midterms, we were going to call them low propensity. So I'm about to jump into the data now, but carry this definition with you. When I talk about low propensity environmental voters, what I mean is people with a really, really high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their #1 priority, yet they are unlikely to vote in next year's midterms. All right, now we're ready. The Environmental Voter Project works in these 17 states. This is where we do that year-round voter targeting and mobilization work. But today's discussion and this hidden potential of green voters in red states report does not focus on all 17 of our EVP states. It only focuses on 9 red states. And those 9 states you see before you. There are 5 purple states, Arizona, Florida, Georgia, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania, and 4 darker red states, Alaska, Iowa, Kansas, and Texas. Obviously, there are a lot of different ways to define what a red state is. What we just used was the Cook Political Report, partisan lean. So what all of these 9 states have in common is that they lean Republican compared to the national average. So all of these states lean Republican. We just had to define red states some way. All right, let's jump into the data. When we built these predictive models, and again, we were doing it as a targeting tool to help mobilize unlikely to vote environmentalists and turn them into better voters, we also started to realize some pretty interesting stuff. The first was, holy moly, are there a lot of low propensity environmental voters in those 5 purple states I just showed you. So again, I want to remind you, a low propensity environmental voter, so the people that you see in that 3rd column there, these are people who have a very high likelihood of listing climate or the environment as their top priority. They are already registered to vote, but their previous voting history tells us that they are unlikely to show up in next year's midterms. And those are some big, big numbers. Now, what do some of the other columns mean? Well, if you see there are almost 871,000 low propensity environmental voters in Pennsylvania, well, that sounds like a big number, but we need some context, right? Well, that 4th column, 2018 total votes cast, that provides a little bit of context. 2018 was the last midterm election. The last midterm election that Pennsylvania had, barely 5 million people voted. So that population of low propensity environmental voters is so big that it equals 17.4% of all votes that were cast in the 2018 midterms. That's a huge opportunity. A huge opportunity, not just for an organization like the Environmental Voter Project, but for the broader climate and environmental movements. We have a big turnout opportunity coming up this year and next year in the environmental movement. And I would add a big duty to boost turnout. You'll see Arizona also has an enormous opportunity. Over 300,000 unlikely to vote environmentalists. That's almost 13% of all votes cast in the last midterm. Florida, where like every election is decided by 20 or 30,000 votes, there are almost 800,000 unlikely to vote environmentalists. And just a word on column 4 there, the 2018 statewide margin. Often there are multiple statewide elections in a particular year. We had to choose one, so we chose the closest one when we listed those 2018 margin numbers. You'll also notice that there's a not applicable for North Carolina. Everybody in North Carolina had an election in 2018. That's how we have a total votes cast number. But there was not a statewide election. There was no Senate or gubernatorial election. So instead, we were adding up everybody who voted for Congress. As you'll see, these are some huge, huge numbers and huge opportunities. This is a big pool of latent political power for the climate movement. All right, let's get into some darker red states. Iowa, Texas, Alaska, Kansas. You'll see some of these have an R+9 or an R+11 lean. That means they are 11 percentage points leaning Republican from the national average. Yet you'll see there are huge populations of these sort of dormant environmental voters, this latent environmental political power. And these are not unimportant states. They are very important states, not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level. And all of them have gubernatorial elections coming up next year. And Iowa, Alaska, and Kansas also have Senate elections coming up next year. These are states where a lot of people don't think of the power of the environmental movement in a place like Iowa. Well, it's there. It's just kind of hidden. We have an enormous amount of potential power. And I know it's kind of frustrating when you look at big numbers of people who don't vote, but I want to encourage you that this is actually an extraordinary opportunity, because we live in a moment in time where it's increasingly hard to get people to change their minds and change their opinions. But remember, these people don't need their minds changed. They don't need their opinions changed. These are people who, like you, shake them awake at night and they're going to scream climate change. It's their #1 priority. They're just not voting. And again, obviously, this is what we do at the Environmental Voter Project. So it's a huge opportunity for us to have an impact, but it's also an opportunity for the broader climate and environmental movements to have an impact. All right, now I want to get into the data, and we want to tell you a little bit about who these people are. So who are these low propensity environmental voters? The first thing is, as I'm sure comes as no surprise to many of you, they are very, very young. They are very, very young. Now, I just want to describe a little bit about what you're seeing, not only on this slide, but a lot of the upcoming slides. You'll see a dark green data set and a light green data set. What the light green data set is percentage of registered voters. So you'll see in Pennsylvania, the top state, 18 to 34-year-olds only make up about 25% of all registered voters. But when you look at that dark green line, 18 to 34-year-olds make up almost 70% of these low propensity environmental voters. So these environmentalists who aren't voting are disproportionately young. Again, I know that doesn't come as an enormous surprise to everybody, but I think it's worthwhile pointing out how disproportionately young these populations are. I mean, in Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, Iowa, and Kansas, 4 out of every 5 of these low propensity environmental voters are between the ages of 18 to 34. This is a very, very young pool of potential political power. Some of you might note that on this slide, unlike the others, there are only 8 states. That's because Alaska allows people to hide their age when they register to vote so that other people doing research and things like that don't have access to it. A lot of people provide their age, but there were enough people who didn't that it kind of polluted our data a little bit. And so we didn't want to present it to you as though it was a full data set. All right, what else do we know about them? There's a huge gender gap. A huge gender gap. Now, again, context is really, really important here. First of all, there's a gender gap among all registered voters. There are just more women voters than men. Women register to vote more often than men do. As you'll see, in 8 of these 9 states, there is a gender gap among registered voters. The only state in which there are more men registered to vote than women is Alaska. And Alaska has significantly more men than women. I think it's almost 5%. So Alaska is interesting for a whole bunch of ways, but a lot of the industry there and things like that drives this. But you'll see, even compared to the underlying baseline gender gap among registered voters, these low propensity environmental voters, whoa, has a huge gender gap, a huge, huge gender gap. Now, to be clear, that gender gap is not driven by vote propensity. What I am not saying here is women are less likely to vote than men and they're more likely to care about the environment. That's actually not the case. If anything, it's the opposite. Women are better voters than men. What you're seeing here is not a relic of vote propensity. It's because women are dramatically more likely to list climate or the environment as their top priority than men are. So whether you're looking at low propensity environmental voters or high propensity environmental voters or middle propensity environmental voters, women are always going to outpace men. But again, this is an important and interesting data point that we've been finding. People who list climate or the environment as their top priority are less likely to be white than the overall population of registered voters. Not by an enormous amount, because there are just so many white people among registered voters, but by a significant amount. And as you'll see, in 8 of our 9 states, with Texas being the only outlier, in the Texas, we're talking about 0.1 percentage points. But in every single one of our states, white people make up a larger percentage of the registered voter population than they do of the low propensity environmental voter population. And what's going on here is 2 things. One, people of color do turn out at lower rates in midterms than white people. But also, what we have seen, but also Yale Program on Climate Change Communications and Pew and Data for Progress, a whole bunch of public opinion surveying shops are seeing that people of color are more likely to care about the environment, regardless of whether they're good voters or bad voters. I don't know what the stereotypical environmentalist is in your mind, but it is not, nor has it been for a long time, people like me. Like, it's not like yuppies wearing Patagonia fleeces. It just isn't. And we're seeing that in all of our data in all of our states. All right. One thing that popped off the charts this last round of predictive models that we ran was Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Now, as you'll see, when you look at the baseline of registered voters, AAPI voters do not make up an enormous part of the registered voter population in any state, Of all the states that we're looking at here, these 9 states, in Georgia, they make up the largest population of registered voters, and they're not even 3%. But they are at least 2 times as prevalent in this population of low propensity environmentals as they are among registered voters. And again, this has almost nothing to do with voting propensity and almost everything to do with the fact that we're seeing that Asian American and Pacific Islanders are more likely to care deeply about climate or the environment than any other ethnic or racial group. Say that again. Asian American and Pacific Islanders are more likely to care deeply about climate and other environmental issues than any other ethnic or racial group. You can see in the actual report that we released, we also linked to some public opinion surveys, and Data for Progress in particular has some really interesting polling data where they're also finding the same thing. AAPI voters are the most disproportionately represented in the climate and environmental movements, and we're seeing that as well. Hispanics. Latinx voters are particularly prominent as well in this population of low propensity environmental voters. As you see, it varies from state to state, but in every state except for Texas, again, Texas is an outlier here, but in every state except for Texas, Hispanics are more prominent among this group of environmentalists than they are in the overall population of registered voters. Excuse me. And we're finding them to be particularly prominent in Arizona, Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida. There are a lot of reasons as to why this is taking place, some of which we know, some of which we don't know, some of which we're guessing about. And in this instance, I'm saying we as in like the broader environmental movement and progressive movement. There are a lot of interesting variables going on here. This is also something that Tony Leiserowitz at Yale Program on Climate Change Communications, who does outstanding public opinion survey work, is picking up in a lot of their work as well. So where does that leave us? It is so important for the broader climate and environmental movements to understand the opportunity that we have over the next 15, 16 months. And I really mean the next 15 or 16 months, because if you take turnout really seriously and voting behavior really seriously, you can't just swoop in a year from this coming October and hope to turn non-voters into voters. All of this year's local elections, all of next year's local elections, all of next year's primaries, they're all leading up into turning these low propensity voters into high propensity voters. It's certainly what we're going to be doing at the Environmental Voter Project, but I know that there are people from other organizations who are on this call, and I hope that this data will also help inform you with your work in understanding what these enormous opportunities are for the climate and environmental movements over the next almost year and a half. You'll see these are some big numbers. And again, I want to reiterate, I know it's frustrating when you see, oh my gosh, all these environmentalists in Pennsylvania or Florida or Arizona were unlikely to vote. This is a big opportunity. Boy, is it hard to change the mind of a climate denier. Boy, is it hard to find someone who doesn't care about climate change and convince them to start caring about it. It's a lot easier to work with these people. They're already with us. They already list climate or some other environmental issue as their #1 priority, or rather they're very likely to. And all we need to do is change their voting behavior. And I won't claim that's easy. Of course it's not. But it's easier. Changing behavior is easier than changing minds and opinions and priorities. And so this is a huge opportunity. Finally, we're about to get to the Q&A. If you want to work with the Environmental Voter Project to take advantage of this opportunity, I'd be remiss not to at least make you aware of those opportunities. We are doing door-to-door canvassing in all 17 of our states, including these 9 purple and red states. In the chat is a link where if you are interested in door-to-door canvassing, you can just express your interest. We will train you, we will send you the lit, we will send you the messaging and the scripts, everything that you need. You can also go to our website and sign up for a phone bank. Just over the next 6 weeks, we are calling into Kansas, Arizona, Florida, and Massachusetts. We always have something going on, and every day we are texting into multiple states. It is election day every day at the Environmental Voter Project. By the end of this year, we will probably be active in over 800 elections just this year. Because remember, the only way to really truly change people's voting behavior in a really efficient and strong and sticky way is to not just parachute in every 2 years, but to use all of these elections as important behavioral intervention opportunities. Finally, we would certainly be grateful for any financial support. We are working year-round, and I can tell you the cheapest, most efficient way to make a voter in 2022 is to talk to them in 2021. This is where you get your best ROI. And so certainly please feel free to support our voter mobilization work. But that is not the ultimate purpose of this briefing and this call. This is about data, the data we just shared with you, and about your questions. So I'm going to stop the slideshow there and get into our questions. If you haven't already put a question in the Q&A, please do. If you have put questions that you have in the Q&A, maybe a staff member has already answered them. If they haven't, maybe I will try to answer them. So the first question that I see here is a biology professor says that at the end of every year, she has a 2-week discussion on climate change and ecological damage, and concludes that discussion with a strong push to get everybody voting and to encourage them to consider to run for office. What recommendations would we make to improve their response? So usually, she says 60% say they vote in federal elections, about 30 or 40% in state, regional, and local elections. Thank you so much for this, this question, Dr. Homer Drummond. So first of all, thank you so much for doing that. Boy, I wish every professor did stuff like that. The second thing I'll say is the latest generation of behavioral scientists have really come to agree upon a basic approach when you're trying to change someone's behavior. And it is not what behavioral economists and behavioral psychologists thought 20 or 30 years ago. 20 or 30 years ago, they thought something called rational choice theory. And the essence of it was you tried to rationally convince someone to take an action. Because what these researchers theorized was that human beings are all rational animals making cost-benefit analyses, and all you have to do is try to rationally convince them of the value of voting or exercising or eating healthy or going to the doctor, any of these actions that you think are important. Well, that doesn't work. It doesn't work at all. In fact, sometimes there's a blowback effect and people are less likely to take an action. Instead, what behavioral scientists have come to realize is that people aren't necessarily rational beings as much as we are expressive beings, by which I mean we are social animals who spend an inordinate amount of time looking at the norms around us, looking at what our peers do, looking at what our neighbors do, and not only trying to adhere to those norms, but trying to create personalities that we think all those other people will like. Now, Dr. Homer Drummond, I have given you a lot of buildup to actually answer your question. What does that mean? What kind of messaging should you use? Well, you should not try to rationally convince these people that it's important to vote. I know we're not supposed to say this, but our one vote, which is often over a denominator of millions of votes, is never going to win in a cost-benefit analysis if we're rational beings. Instead, you should try to use subtle forms of peer pressure and social pressure. Obviously, you don't want to be mean or manipulative, but maybe you want to say something like, hey, did all of you know that whether you vote or not is public record? And all you need to do is request a record from your local town or city, and you can see who votes in which elections. That will get a lot of people to vote. What you also might say is something like, oh, you know, last year's class reported that 80% of them voted in federal elections. That will just plant an idea in their head. Obviously, you don't want to lie to them, but it'll plant an idea in their head that, oh my gosh, people like me vote. Most of the people like me vote. I need to adhere to that social norm. There are a lot of ways that you can fit into that theoretical framework, Professor, but I would suggest that it all be that kind of things, those kind of things. Using peer pressure, using social pressure. I know that sounds negative and I know it sounds manipulative, but it only works because deep down, these people want to do this. They want to be thought of as good voters. And so what you're actually doing is trying to help them adhere to a norm that they already want to live up to. And so you're actually helping them become a better version of themselves that they already want to show to the rest of the world. All right. Another question. Let's see. It looks like some of these questions that have been asked have already been answered, I think. Someone asked a great question, Robert Stryker. I understand that EVP likely can't do all red-leaning states, but beyond your 17 states, could you release the EVP potential of other red-leaning states, i.e. Wisconsin? The approach that we take at the Environmental Voter Project is as follows. One, we go into states that have huge, disproportionately large populations of non-voting environmentalists. We need that big target population because then we can have a big impact. It doesn't matter how good we are at the Environmental Voter Project at turning non-voters into voters. If there are only 20 like non-voting environmentalists in your state, who cares? We're not going to change policy making at all. And so the first thing that we do is we look for where is there the most latent political power in these states? What's the second thing we look for? Which states have elections every year? Repetition is so important when you're trying to change behavior. And there are a lot of states, not a lot, but a fair number of states who, for good government reasons, don't have elections in odd years. They've moved all of their local elections to coincide with even year elections, which is usually a good public policy decision. It gets more people to vote for city council and mayor and things like that. But it's bad for us. It means we get fewer bites at the apple when we're trying to turn non-voters into voters. And then the third thing, certainly we care not just about federal policy, but about state and local policy. And so we're going to go into states where there's room to move the dial on all of those things. So the questioner asks in particular about Wisconsin. Yeah, no one can deny the political importance of Wisconsin. Boy, is that an important state at a federal, state, and local level. It doesn't make sense for the Environmental Voter Project. And it doesn't make sense for us because every time we drop the needle and measure where there are likely to be lots of these low propensity environmental voters, there are very, very few in Wisconsin. And we feel like it would be disingenuous to ask our volunteers and our donors to support EVP working there. We are not the highest leverage investment of your time or your funds in Wisconsin. We are better in the states where we are. And the final aspect of your question, could we release EVP potential of other states? We'll look into it. There is some hard data, some sort of softer data like policy analysis, movement, and things like that that we get into. But we could certainly look into releasing that. But what I don't want to do is set up the expectation that like X state is the next one on our expansion list, because things change really, really quickly. And we're always dropping the needle and measuring which states have the most potential. So some state that might have just missed the cut 4 months ago might miss the cut by 13 states a year from now. But we'll certainly look into it, So someone else asks, do we know the main barriers to getting these people to vote? Is it access or motivation? So it's a very, very good question. And the honest, although ultimately very disappointing question is no, we don't know. In fact, no one knows. If anyone tells you they know why someone does not vote, they are either dramatically oversimplifying it or they're being dishonest with you. And here's why. Any social scientist can tell you it's really easy to set up an experiment that tells you how to get someone to take an action. That's what economists and psychologists and political scientists and sociologists are really, really good at. Set up an experiment, give someone a $2 coupon and see if they buy your coffee. Then give them a $1 coupon and see if they buy your coffee. Like we're good at setting up experiments to figure out how to get someone to vote. What's really, really hard is to do the opposite. What's really hard is to figure out, why aren't these people taking an action? And one of the biggest reasons it's so hard is because the only way to measure that is to ask them. The only way to find out why aren't these people doing X is to ask them, why aren't you doing X? And when you ask people about voting or other things that society views as good or important, people lie their pants off. They lie their pants off. It's one of the hardest, what's called survey biases or response biases to overcome. When you ask people why they aren't doing something that they know society views as important, they are much more likely to give you a socially palatable excuse than the real reason for them not voting. Now, what I can tell you is this. One, the data that I just got finished telling you about in red states, a lot of it holds true in purple and blue states as well. And so when we talk about these environmental voters, whether they be low propensity or middle propensity or whatever, they are more likely to be young than old. They are more likely to be people of color than white. And they are more likely to make less than $50,000 a year than more. And so Ross, when you asked that question and mentioned access, yeah, I think access is a big part of it. It's certainly not all of it. And you can go to a report on our reports and studies tab, which I think is called something like, why do people lie about voting? But it goes into why what I'm about to say isn't all of the answer. And I encourage you to do that. But yes, ballot access is very important for the environmental movement, because people of color, poor people, and young people are disproportionately represented in the environmental movement right now. And what do those three people have in common, those three groups of people? Well, wherever any government entity, state, local, or federal, is trying to make it harder for someone to vote, they are targeting one of those three groups or all of them: people of color, young people, and poor people. And so if anybody's making it harder for someone to vote, chances are they are disproportionately bleeding power from the environmental movement. Now, can I go a step further and say, oh, that's where this turnout problem comes from? No, it's not. And we have a whole lot of data to lead us to believe that that's not all that's going on there. But it's a great, great question. All right, I hope I'm reaching a lot of these questions. These are all really, really great questions. A lot of great questions about states that we're planning to move into, things like that. Let's see. Texas is a big state. Are the low propensity environmental voters in Texas grouped in any particular cities or regions? Large metropolitan areas, suburbs, exurbs, or rural? Really, really great question. They are, so, let me provide some background before answering your question, Jay. In almost all of our states, these low propensity environmental voters are disproportionately likely to be in urban or suburban areas, not exurban and rural areas. Now, boy, is there a lot of nuance. Boy, are there a lot of exceptions to that rule that I just said. And remember, one of the first slides that I showed you, one of the methodology slides, I told you about the difference between polling and predictive models. We are not targeting people as big demographic or geographic groups. We are targeting people as individuals. And even if there is one rural, low propensity environmental voter in one county in rural Kansas, you better believe we're going to target and mobilize Mary Smith at 123 Main Street. We're going to get them all. But in almost all of our states, this is much more likely to be an urban and suburban population. Texas is a little bit different. Texas is a little bit different. Part of it is because everything's different in Texas. Part of it has to do, I think, although I don't know, with a lot of the sprawl due to lack of zoning in Texas. And so, like, boy, is it hard to tell the difference between a suburb and an exurb in Texas. I say this as someone who's a Northeasterner, maybe I'm totally wrong. But when you look at voter files and look at maps, it's a much more sort of even spread going out from the cities than we see in most other states, even other southern and southeastern and southwestern states. In Texas, there's a much more like gentle slope going out towards rural areas. And a lot of people who would in other states be called exurban, but in Texas, at least from the voter file level, it's a little bit harder to tell that difference. Really, really great questions. Peter asks, have the voter suppression laws in certain states affected EVP's impact? It's a great question, Peter. As I mentioned before, we certainly know that those voter suppression laws disproportionately target people who care about environmental issues. Knowingly or not, it just happens to be who they're targeting. Has it affected our organization's impact on voter turnout? It would be really hard to measure that, because we can't run controlled experiments. We can't run sort of counterexamples where like half of Georgia doesn't have voter suppression laws or things like that. But what I can say is this. Georgia just announced about a week and a half ago, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, a new round of voter purges where they were purging people from their registered voter file. We immediately jumped into action. I think there were 101, 102,000 people who they announced were being purged. We immediately got access to the list. Our field and data director, Peter, who is helping answer questions in chat right now, jumped on it, found, I think, almost 8,000 of them who were likely to list climate or the environment as their top priority. And we immediately started reaching out to them, calling and texting, so that they could try to cure getting purged, because they had a 40-day window to reply to a postcard that was sent to them or contact their local elections office to try to stop getting kicked off. What we do know is it was hard to reach a lot of those people, which comes as no surprise. If you are about to get purged, chances are you're hard to reach. But we were able to reach some, which means these were normally people who would not only be in our turnout universe, Peter, but we would be able to get them on the phone. We would be able to get them at the door. We would be able to text them. And so the mere fact that we know that some of these unlikely to vote environmentalists were getting purged, and we were able to reach some of them, not a lot of them, but some of them, means, yeah, our target universe is being impacted by this. Probably just a little bit, but it is certainly being impacted. Hannah asks a great question. Do you circle back on the people you've influenced to vote and see if they become lifetime voters, and or what makes them stop voting? Yes, we absolutely circle back. And so you may remember that slide about our cumulative impact in at least our 12 states, not any of our new states, in turning these non-voters into consistent voters who vote in federal, state, and local elections. We don't yet have a rich enough data set to understand what might be unique about the people who fall off the wagon. Do some people fall off the wagon? Yeah, some people become really, really great consistent voters, and then they like skip a local election, and we go right back at them and try to get them again. And so we know who those voters are, but we haven't been doing this for long enough to really be able to have a large and rich enough data set, Hannah, to understand what might be unique about these people, what might make them stop. But what we do know, and it's not just us, a lot of people have done research on this, is that voting is a sticky habit. You get someone to vote once, they are significantly more likely to vote again. Significantly more likely. And that's happening for two reasons. One, a lot of behavior is habitual, is habit forming. But two, it goes back to the public nature of the voter file. If I get you to vote for the first time in some low turnout city council race, it only takes 2 months for the record of you having voted to show up on public voter files. And then everybody who's running campaigns in your state says, holy moly, Hannah just voted in a city council race. She's definitely a likely voter for our gubernatorial. We got to go get her. We got to go make sure that she votes. In fact, we also have to poll her to figure out what issues she cares about. And now you've gone from a second-class citizen who had a public record of not voting. So why on earth would any policymaker care what your priorities were? And now they're tripping over themselves to get at you and poll you to figure out what issues should drive their campaign. Okay, it's 8:26. We have time for one more question. What percentage of elections have climate as a major issue? For example, it didn't come up much in the New York mayor's race. And Jennifer asked that. Yeah, Jennifer, not many. It's becoming more prominent, but you highlight the main reason why the Environmental Voter Project is doing what we're doing. Don't get me wrong. It is always important to elect the so-called right people. Boy, is it important. It's not what EVP does, but there are a lot of groups who endorse great climate champions, and boy, is it important to support them to elect the so-called right people. But what Jennifer alludes to in her question is also important, because even when we elect the so-called right person, if there aren't enough voters who care deeply about climate and the environment, that politician is never going to spend their political capital on these priorities. They're just not. Simply by winning an election doesn't mean you get to snap your fingers and just enact everything that you want. No, there needs to be demand in the marketplace. Even when we supply the right policymakers, even when we elect the right people, if there aren't enough voters, not non-voters, but voters who prioritize climate, man, not only is it going to be hard to elect the right people, but even when we do elect the right people, why on earth are they going to spend their political capital on something that voters don't care about? And so, Jennifer, there are some elections where climate becomes a top priority. Certainly, prior to COVID, in the very early the Democratic primaries, so I know that seems like 4,000 years ago, but in Iowa and New Hampshire, when you only polled Democrats who were likely to show up for their Iowa caucus or New Hampshire primary, climate change was often the number 2 most important issue that they had. And guess what happened? All the candidates started falling over themselves to be viewed as climate leaders. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that they're disingenuous. They're doing what politicians do. Politicians need to go where the votes are, or else they don't get to be politicians anymore. It's the basic arithmetic of how politics work and how elections work. And so far too few elections, Jennifer, far too few elections have climate as a major issue. But that's something that we're trying to change at the Environmental Voter Project. And it's something that I hope all of this data highlights to all of you as being possible. I do not think we are just months away from climate being the #1 issue in every election. We're not. But is the potential there? Yeah, it is. Maybe not in every election, but in a whole lot of them. There are a lot of potential climate voters sitting on the sidelines, ready for the Environmental Voter Project, but also the broader climate and environmental movements to get them into the game. So I told all of you at the beginning that we would not keep you late. It is now 8:29 on the East Coast, 5:29 on the West Coast. I know that we didn't get to all of your questions, and I sincerely apologize for that. Hopefully, Ren and Peter were able to answer a lot of the ones that I didn't answer in the chat. If you still have questions, we will try to copy and paste them and find a way to get back to you. I'll just reiterate that if you want to volunteer to contact these voters, we are running phone banks and text banks and canvases all the time. There's a link in the chat, environmentalvoter.org/events, and you can see all of these trainings. You can also support our work financially, but most importantly, I hope you take this data with you. And I know we didn't have time to get into all of the nuance and nitty gritty, but hopefully it informs the work that you are doing in your local and state and federal organizations in your part of the climate movement. So thank you to all of you for taking this time out of your evening. And all of us really appreciate you being a part of our work at the Environmental Voter Project. Thank you, everybody. Good night.